It was a coincidence on the calendar as we were working through the spring, working through the Sermon on the Mount, that the passage we come to that would fall on today has to do with family relationships, specifically how to love your spouse. And the whole Sermon on the Mount is Jesus teaching us how to best love God and to love others. And in the sphere of marital relationships, he gives us some guidance on how to best love. And so we're going to jump into this here today. In an ideal world, and just like the movies, people fall in love and ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after. Okay? That's the ideal world. Most of us have never lived exactly in that world. We've maybe found our prince, we've maybe found our princess. Sometimes we're still looking for a prince or princess. Sometimes we find out that that prince or princess is really a toad, right? So we realize that the fairy tales don't always tell the story. And we live with a desire for a special relationship that would create a sense of family for us. There are chapters in marriage that are hard. There are days that are hard. There are periods that we think we just have to give up on this dream that we had before when we stood at the altar and gave our vows to one another. And this sermon reminds us, as Jesus is teaching us, what are the things that make love work, the things that make a marital relationship work. And he gives us a couple things to take a look at here as we take a look at marriage. We know that marriage is the most unique, it's the most intimate of relationships. It's the one that can potentially bring us the greatest joy, but also the greatest disappointment as well. And so we live in the tension of those things. Now, history shows us that in general, the tendency is that men can treat women very badly. That's just a generalization, but it tends to be true. And so Jesus, he's talking to men in this passage, but what applies to the men also applies to the women, because sometimes women can get a little nasty too. So even though it's applied to men here, this is a passage that's for everybody because of the context that he's given it in. We know that Christianity has done more to elevate the respect and the role of women than almost anything in all of history. All throughout the Bible, women are not put down, but they're put down as equals, loved by God and given gifts to be able to love and serve and for their purpose in their life. And so we take that as a given here as we get into today. So I know that in the Bible, God knew that men would often treat women badly, and so there were many community laws that would protect women. That if a woman was being abused, or if a woman was being neglected, that was put into the law in the Old Testament of how the community could come along and help protect the victim in that situation. God gave a bottom line to men that if you're not going to voluntarily treat women with love and respect, there's going to be some laws that are waiting for you to make sure that happens. Now, of course, nobody wants to live in a relationship where law cultivates the love that's there. We want love to be cultivated voluntarily. And sometimes spouses have to learn to love or to learn to re-love again. And so he tells us in this passage, Jesus says, don't rely on the laws that teach you how to love. Let the love come from your heart, because that's what love is really all about. So we look at the two different aspects that Jesus taught about marital relationships. One is just sexual purity. The other is dealing with divorce. We're going to look at the first one here in Matthew 5, verses 27 to 30. Jesus is teaching. He says, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. Yes, one of the 10 Commandments tells us to be faithful to our spouse. Jesus takes it a step further, and he says, don't just be faithful physically, but be faithful in your heart. Be faithful mentally. Make sure that your spouse has all of your attention, inside and out. and that adultery is not just something you do physically, but it's something that can happen within your heart as well. And when he's saying it's better to pluck out your eye or cut off your hand than to commit adultery, he's being here facetious. He's saying even if you took out your eyes and you cut off your hands, you wouldn't fix the problem, because the problem's where? It's in our hearts. When our hearts desire somebody else for us than God has intended us for to be with, that's where we get off the path and we go into adultery, whether it's on the inside or whether it happens on the outside. And so Jesus says adultery is a heart problem. It's not a physical problem. And if it's a heart problem, then it's a love problem, right? So Jesus is getting right to the core of things again. And this was radical to them back then, because they thought, oh, there's a law. I didn't touch, I didn't do, I didn't step out, I'm okay. But he says, let's look at the heart. What goes on in the heart will very possibly be acted out on. So start with the heart. Fix the heart so that nothing in this case will happen. And if we love our spouse or our potential future spouse, then we're going to watch our heart so that we don't get attracted into something that's going to lure us away from truly loving that person that's either in our lives or will be in our lives. We live in an age where the impact of pornography has just risen off the charts. Because of the impact of pornography being so accessible and so anonymous than it used to be in generations before, so many people have gone astray in their relationships because of getting trapped in something that they did with their eyes and that led them on the wrong path. And we need to come together and say, we're going to put a stand against this, that we're not going to let that be a form of entertainment. It's not going to be something that's going to lead us off onto a track that is going to lead us away from truly loving our spouse and truly loving our bodies as God has said for us to love it. Sexual relationships outside of marriage are applauded in private but condemned in public. We have this double standard in our culture. People say, well, if it makes you happy and you really love each other, then go for it. But in public, it gets criticized. You know, the whole Me Too movement over this past year has brought out that what happens in private does matter in public. And hopefully we'll get to the place in our culture to line up with what Jesus said. And Jesus said, what happens in your heart matters. What happens in your heart matters. And if your heart is in the wrong place, it'll lead you to the wrong place. If your heart's in the right place, it'll lead you to the right place as well. Our bodies belong to God. It's His temple. And the only person we're to be connected with in an intimate way is the person that God has given us as our spouse. There's no exceptions. The Bible's very clear on that. Let's aim high. Let's let our standards be high when it comes to sexual purity. We don't want to disgrace the person we love, our family, our friends, our community, our church, by stepping outside the bounds of the commitment that we've made. Whether it's physically or whether it's with our eyes, let's set that standard high. And we could be like Job, who said, we read in Job 31:1, he said, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. And since it's so complicated these days with all the pansexual scales that we have here, let's make a covenant with our eyes that we are going to commit to God, to keep purity before it. We live in a society that tells us that you don't have to wait for marriage. We live in a society that tells us that you can do what you want to before marriage, in marriage, after marriage. It's okay as long as your heart is dependent upon it. But God has another way, and so we strive for that. The second aspect of Jesus' words deal with divorce. We read in Matthew 5:31 and 32. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus reminds us that divorce is possible as a legal consideration. It was put into the law that there is a legal way to make a divorce happen. Not that it's God's standard, but if it has to happen, there's a legal way to do it. But he said, there's too much of this going on that people just decide, oh, I'm tired of this wife, I want a new one, so I'm just going to file my little divorce thing and just move on to the next person. That was happening in Jesus' day, and it happens today as well. People get tired of the flavor of the month. They want to look for the new one. And so that becomes a problem there, where marriage is not taken seriously. There are different interpretations amongst Christians about to what extent divorce is okay or not okay in God's eyes. And there's not a lot of clear things in the Bible that talk about this, because we know that divorce is messy. Divorce has a lot of gray areas in it. But there are a few things that are clear from the Bible. There are 4 things that God has clearly said. He did say, what God has put together, let no man separate. So he takes marriage seriously, that this is a commitment for life. And he doesn't want it to be separated until death do us part. We also know that if a person cheats on their spouse, that is considered stepping outside of that marriage vow, and that person has deserted that person in body and in soul as well. And so that leaves one person as the guilty party who has sinned against God, but yet it leaves somebody as kind of the victim in the situation as well. We also read that if a person decides, I just don't want to be married to this person anymore, and I just want to go off and find somebody else, that is a sin as well. Deserting one's spouse and breaking that just because I don't want to be with this person anymore is also looked in God's eyes as a wrong reason for separating. So desertion, adultery, those are things that are outside of God's will for marriage. And we also read in Malachi, the book of Malachi, God says that he hates divorce. God says, I hate divorce because it causes lots of problems. It fixes some problems, but it causes other problems. And so in God's eyes, he's trying to keep us on the path to where that is not a part of our everyday life. But we know that reality is messy. We know that relationships are messy. People change. Sometimes things don't work out in the way that we thought it was going to at the beginning. We know that there are so many different things that come up. Well, what about this? What about that? If you knew I had to put up with, if you knew what I had to put up with, these irreconcilable differences. Well, first of all, every marriage has irreconcilable differences, right? Even the happiest marriages. There are just some things we just don't see eye to eye on. Now, it takes 2. Sometimes one spouse is causing more of a problem than the other spouse is. One spouse is trying to make it work while another one's trying to run away from it all. It gets messy. The Bible doesn't really address all of these messy issues, that come outside of just those 4 things that I mentioned. And so if we're in a marriage that's not going well, that there's not adultery or desertion as a part of it, but there's irreconcilable differences, we have to really get serious before God and say, what is God's will for our marriage in that situation? We're taught to ask, am I happy in marriage? But the better question is to ask, am I healthy in marriage? Is this marriage pulling me down? Is it drawing life from me, or is it giving me life? Now, not that that's a basis to decide whether I should divorce or not, but we need to ask those questions. We need to ask those questions that will help us to seek God's will on how to make it healthy in order to make it happy. Because a healthy marriage is a happy marriage. And we got to work on the healthy part more than just the happy part. Just the fact that we fell out of love is kind of a lame excuse, because what that means is saying, I want to find somebody else to love. That this person doesn't draw the emotions that were there before. And we have to really take a look that in our marriages that we're not being selfish, but we're learning to be giving, and that we're learning to give life to each other. That is the goal that God has. We live in a fallen world. We deal with each other's sins. We deal with each other's weaknesses. But how can love, forgiveness, grace cover those things? We have to take an honest look at that. There's not an easy answer to it. And you go home today saying, what is the conclusion of that? The conclusion is, let's seek God's will for marriage. Let's seek God's will for sexual purity. Let's make our marriages strong. Let's work on it together. Even if the other person's not working on it, do everything you can to work on it. And pray, and let's hope that God will change the hearts of the wayward one. Divorce should be the last resort. There are many ways to avoid it when we live in a commitment of God's love that brings it to marriage and family. Let's just keep aiming high. Let's not let adultery fill our souls or our relationships as well. And men, if you love your wives, then you're giving your kids, your grandkids, your community the best gift of all. Happy Mother's Day. I know this is kind of a downer sermon on Mother's Day, but we want marriages to be strong, and God can do that. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach us here today. As we go into the communion, we think about the words, remember me. Remember me. And I know that today's topic has been pretty heavy as we deal with the sins of our past, the things that have hurt our relationships, the lust, the adultery, the divorce. I don't know where you're at on that whole scale of the topics, but we're reminded that the power of the gospel is in remember me. When we think back of where we've been, what we've done, what's been done to us, we remember me. Jesus says, remember me, because what I did on the cross for you totally is enough, sufficient for taking care of anything we've done wrong or what's been done wrong to us. That's the power of the gospel, and that's what we celebrate at this time. That is the real message for today.